Hi, everyone. Welcome to September 2021 Becky's Anonymous live stream. We're so excited to be here again. Tonight, we're talking about the really important topic of the school to prison pipeline and what particularly that means in this era of COVID. How can we be thinking about the school to prison pipeline, and more importantly, how can we be thinking about what we're going to do about it? And of course, to our audience, specifically thinking about our role as white women in the school to prison pipeline, how can we be better matching our actions with our intention to end white supremacy? I'm really excited tonight. We have our first guest that we ever had on our live stream, Ayesha Wilson, who some of you may be familiar with. And she is a member of the Cambridge School Committee, which you all have heard about a lot from her, but she also is a member of the Cambridge YWCA and the secretary of the NAACP. And you've seen her, like I said, on our first live stream, and she's been back a couple of times, but she's here tonight to, again, help us dive deep into this conversation. And we also have with us today Tony Clark, which we're really excited for the first time to welcome. And Tony Clark is a principal strategy consultant of the T. Clark Group. He, like Ayesha, also is a graduate of the Cambridge Public Schools. He currently serves as a tenured professor of English literature and learning communities at Bunker Hill Community College in Boston. And he is the former liaison for equitable and inclusive communities for the office of Mayor Mark C. McGovern, Mark McGovern, where he was charged with uncovering and creating systems to dismantle white supremacy. He also remains a faculty member of the English department of Bronx Community College, where he has taught for 15 years. So Ayesha and Tony, thank you so much for being here. Really excited to have you. And we're going to dive in first to talking about the school to prison pipeline, just kind of in general. But then again, we're going to bring in, of course, what we're all talking about right now, which is what does all of this mean, particularly now with COVID as another factor in this. I want to start our conversation with really grounding us in the importance of this conversation and why all of us, no matter if we have our own children or all of us are connected to children. And so want to just ground us in kind of why this is important for all of us to be talking about. And so this is a quote from Nelson Mandela that I'll read, and then we'll hear from Ayesha and Tony what this quote means to them from their experience. So Nelson Mandela tells us that there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And today we're going to be talking a lot about how we're treating our children now, but more importantly, where do we need to go in terms of treating our children? And obviously, when we say our children, talking about our country's children, our nation's children. So would love to first invite Tony, since this is your first time, Tony. Would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that quote. What does that quote bring up for you when you think about your experience? You're a well-respected community leader among adults, but more importantly, why we're so excited to have you here is because you're such a cherished leader among young people. So really just a valuable voice in us really understanding where the youth voice and children's voices are in this as well. So welcome, Tony.
It's a lot of pressure considering I was a youth a little while ago, right? So it's tough, right? You know, when you think about the conversation, I want to say I appreciate, the invitation, is that we're in a country where I think a couple of weeks ago, right before we started school up here in the north, I guess above the Mason-Dixon line, there was a number of conversations around the excessive arrest in a small county in Florida. And I remember one of the conversations was one of the parents, and the parent had mentioned my child was crying and he was placed in handcuffs. And so when I listen to the quote and I kind of think about tonight's conversation, is that we are a nation that has no problem handcuffing Black and brown children specifically. And that's not necessarily, everyone, in this country, but I think in terms of there's a level of normalizing that when it comes to, Black and brown children. So I think, and poor white children for that matter, but, speaking right now to the example that was in the small county in Florida, I'll let be nameless, but it spoke to just the kind of the normalization of the adultification of Black and brown children and disregard for their bodies. So I think when I listen to the quote, or we need to be better about how we look at and treat our most vulnerable, and often our most vulnerable, often also our most marginalized, and so it's critically important that in this work, that both I'm intentional about those images, and that is a society own that they occur and not ignore that they do. So I'll put a pin in it.
Thank you. And I'll just jump in and just say, I think, just to kind of piggyback on what Tony said, it's really important that we name that in our spaces with our young people. Like what does that look like and mean to embrace the relationships that we're having with our young people? How are we being intentional around that? How are we looking at the social determinants of life when we're looking at young people specifically in our classroom spaces? And what is our role and what is our duty as educators, as social justice leaders, as folks of influence? And how do we just carry the mission of the work that we're passionately trying to instill on our young people around, who they are as individuals and who they are in a collective community. Right. And I think the uniqueness to Cambridge, and I think we'll talk about this a lot more later, is just that a lot of people say we're in a bubble, right? And that the safetiness of like our streets, and even though our streets have been a little hot lately, but the overall bubble in our Cambridge community is that we know our cops, we know our police, our police officers are our buddies, our mentors, and different things of that sort. And what we also are not really preparing them for is the future beyond our streets in our community. What does it look like if they cross over a bridge and go into Boston? What does it look like if they go into Somerville or into any of our neighboring communities, right? What's that interaction with a police officer? What's the interaction with adults, right? And how are they judged and viewed? So where's the responsibility for us to help in teaching that? How do we model that? And I think really just going to the quote, it's really about how do we stay true to the efforts and the work that we have to kind of build on, so that we're able to create a legacy that's not about limiting or marginalizing populations of the most marginalized people, but really thinking about everybody. It's all the people, it's all the kids, it's the whole community, and not just these specific marginalized communities.
Thank you both. I'd love to hear, both of you obviously do a lot of activism, a lot of community leading, do a lot of work, but it seems like both of you have really come to the conclusion that this really is the crux, if not a major part of the crux of ending white supremacy in our country. That kind of our youth, school to prison pipeline, these issues are really at the core of what's going to make a difference. And so I'd love if you could share a little bit about why you feel that way. What brings you to kind of this place of really emphasizing this as a major part of this work?
You want to go, Ayesha?
Sure, I'll start it off. Thank you. I mean, I think the passion for me is that I'm one of those kids, right? Like I was one of them. And I get that growing up in low income housing, growing up to a single mom, and being the oldest of three girls was a challenge, and definitely something that in my community, I saw, gun violence. I, witnessed a lot of drugs, a lot of substance use and abuse, a lot of just fights. And just a lot of things that I know was more so impacting our Black and brown men or young men at that time versus women, but also just thinking about what does that look like in the school setting, and I think there was one time where like a police officer came and like grabbed one of my classmates from school, right? And so thinking about those moments and thinking about that experience for me, that experience for my peers, and we never talked about it, right? So now as I take the moment and opportunity to reflect on it, and as a community leader, I don't take that experience lightly. I don't, think of it as an anomaly. Like, it's one of those things that in our community, this happens in its own little spaces, but it plays true to the community as a whole. Once young people start knowing, hey, my buddy got picked up, or this person got picked up, or I saw, or I heard the gunshots at night, or whatever the case was or is. And so I think my work comes from a personal place, right? I've been through it personally and witnessed a lot of my peers go through different facets of the school to prison pipeline and or dying due to the streets and the crimes that have taken place. And then I speak about it professionally as a social worker and thinking with my work with the young people and as a, school committee member, that I hear the stories and I know some of these kids who have passed, in the last couple of months and or are going to jail because they're carrying guns because they don't feel safe. So I think it comes from a deeper place for me. It's not just about what I read about or see about in the news. It's like, these are the kids that I serve. And these were me and my peers, right? And the experiences that we had growing up as well.
I think for me, it's interesting. Thank you for the question. It's really rooted in this idea of debunking the idea there can only be one. I think oftentimes when you're in school, it's like, you know, language, right? Like you're the good kid, or really, you're really a nice kid. And oftentimes that becomes this kind of qualifier for maybe one or two black children. It's like, all right, you have the black boy, you have the black girl, but the rest of you, you guys can go away and, hopefully everything will work itself out. We don't see those things done with other subgroups, right? And so one of the things that has been very important to me, and this is interesting how you have, someone from the political lens on this, a policymaker and a policy troublemaker, right? And so I think that's important to kind of have these things gel, is that I always found normalizing the status quo is a bad thing. So I never understood why couldn't there be 20 of us in this program or 15 of us, taking this trip to Europe. But I just always felt as though kind of exposing our young people, but all of our people to the world outside of themselves. I grew up in the Port, which is a neighborhood it's a stone throw from Kendall Square, where it's said to be the most innovative, quarter mile in the nation. Some would say, the world. And when I grew up there, I didn't see, these dreams. It's in a lot of ways, I felt much of it was a dream deferred. I was like, what's going on here? But there was, as we all know on this call, urban planners are looking at what's this community going to look at 15, 20, 30 years down the line. Sometimes when you're in these communities, you're not given that foresight. Not by your teachers, not by your community folks. They're essentially kind of living from day to day. And I always thought something was wrong or abnormal. I never thought that was normal. I thought we had to kind of disrupt the normalization of that idea. So I always thought that, look, why can't we have things for a multitude of us? Very much kind of a self-reliance perspective. And if we don't have them within, the community, let's create them. And so it was really important to me to think about making sure I wasn't the only, quote unquote, the only one. Because if I'm the only one, then we're in bad shape. You know what I mean? There has to be hundreds of us, right? And what I don't know, other people do know. And I just felt that we had to have more disruption. And I think the system, all those systems, but particularly the education system I speak to, and even our social network, our social programs that are supposed to provide wraparound services, they aren't geared to essentially how do you reimagine a community? An individual out of a great, architect of social justice, James Comer out of Yale University, has a phenomenal book called Rally the Village, and where he essentially says, let's take all these entities that are in our community, from community youth centers to churches to synagogues, and let's be really intentional about how do they all work and create levers for young people to succeed. And I think for me, I always felt that when it came to Black and brown children, we weren't using as many levers. We may try one and give up. And so my work, or the work that I believe that I'm a part of, is really rooted in kind of pushing the proverbial status quo and pushing on policy leaders to think differently and not to be so caught up in, platitudes, and just, just really kind of move the work. So hopefully that makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you both. What it brought up for me is that this question for white people in this, right? For a lot of white people who don't have that firsthand experience, who don't have friends necessarily who are sharing what it's like to be on that side of it. I'd love if you all could share. I think one question I have is kind of, there's two ways white people participate in the school to prison pipeline, and that's one is kind of the bystander, right? The people who just kind of maybe don't do anything or say they're doing something but aren't really. And then there are some white people who are really taking a very active role in perpetuating this. And I would love if you all could just kind of share in your experience, pre-COVID, we'll kind of get to COVID. This term school to prison pipeline has been around, I think, at least maybe, definitely at least 5 years before COVID, but, longer. So there are a lot of white people, now in 2020 that have heard this term, maybe even using it themselves. But before we jump into COVID, I want to take a moment to just kind of reflect on, you all have been working in the context of, ending the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
What have you seen as the help, the not so helpful roles that white people have taken, and also the helpful roles that they've taken? But again, clarifying that, right, there's really this kind of bystander piece to this. And then there are those people who are taking a much more active role.
For me, I taught in New York City public schools for about 12 years, which was one of the best experiences I ever had. However, the school that I worked at, Martin Luther King High School, was directly across from LaGuardia. So every day, our children at MLK were walking through metal detectors, whereas LaGuardia, they were just walking in the building, and so it was like, and then at one point, this is a little, I want to say like 2007-ish, there was a lot of money that came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to make schools smaller, right? And so that meant that there were a number of folks who were, so New York City went from, let's say, 500 high schools to like 1,300 overnight, if they were like kind of breaking up high schools, so there were schools within schools. And so what happened was, as you can imagine, it's hard enough to find 5 good principals, and now you have to find 1,300 good principals and assistant principals. So, and I don't want to disparage anyone, but schools were just popping up, right? And so you may have had a white woman, who had every intention to want to work, if it's, the school I worked at was on 66 in Amsterdam. However, it was a zone school for Harlem and the South Bronx. So you may have thought that you was getting a prime, location. You can go to the gym after, whatever may have you. Literally right around the corner when our kids would walk outside, it was a studio, The View, right? Like The View, the show. And there were many times where guests would come. At one point, when the former president Barack Obama then Senator Obama, was coming, and the kids would see. And then it would be interesting how they would police. I'm talking about teachers, educators would police one side of the street with LaGuardia versus how they would police and have the police. I hate to even say police. The other side, which was, the King kids, right? Get out the street, the motorcades coming, and it was very aggressive in the language versus, wow, this is pretty cool, right? He's coming down the street, you know what I mean? And I just found that and this is also interesting because there are a number of private schools that are also on like the Broadway side of the street, So then, when our students would like walk up to the train station, the disposition towards the educators who were maybe walking up would say, okay, let those kids get on the train first. Like literally we're telling our kids to let other kids get on the train first. Like these things were really happening. Where am I going with this? And so in 2016, this is years later, there was a study that was done in New York City, is that 99% of the kids that were taken out in handcuffs were Black or Latinx, right? 99%. So I remember overwhelmingly, and I don't have the numbers, so I want to be fair to folks, but kids were being taken out in classes, and they were being overwhelmingly, people who were calling for security, not for a dean, not for a principal, or even themselves to maybe step out and talk to this young person, were white women. And at the time, I think a lot of that was a byproduct of they were trying to grow this system really quick, and it was like, okay, who wants to work here, right? It wasn't, we weren't talking about cultural competency and a lot of the things that we're talking about today. And I was like, wow, like, no one's kind of peeping this whole conversation that was going on, and I found it quite fascinating. In addition to that, and I'll put a pin in it. So that was one way in terms. I don't think they understood all of us, but we're specifically talking about white women, because our staff was about 75% white women, and I don't want to be ageist, but a lot of cases there's maybe the third to maybe I would say average 3 years teaching experience, right? And so maybe that's how they were taught in graduate school as well. I think we have to put we have to acknowledge that. I mean, I remember going to New York University for graduate school in education, and a lot of it was really, they wouldn't even look at me as a black male, and I'm like, I'm here to teach. They would always look at white women. And what's interesting about we'll talk about Cambridge later, one of the faculty members really revered, and obviously let him be nameless, he started the pilot school, which I was in Cambridge, and I'm like, hold up, if he started that school in the way in which he teaches this class, like how is he looking at black kids when he was talking about the creation of this respective school? I'll end with this, is that, and so years later, I started. I don't think it's a promotion. I assumed the role of administrator within the same district, and the district superintendent was the same. She was a white woman, older white woman, and she was the same white woman who at one point made some disparaging comments around, we can't look at the fact that we have metal detectors on one side, metal detectors on the other side. It's not a big deal. We have to keep in mind who's coming into this school here, right? A school in which folks like Jonathan Coles wrote about. And we were having this conversation around, because as I said earlier, the schools were kind of building as they go. In the school, so we were on year 3, and essentially we had to order desks. And I tell the story, and it gets me really sad. And we said, okay, we're going to have incoming freshman class is going to be 100. Let's say 100. Well, she said, well, you don't have to buy 100 desks. You don't have to order 100 desks. Just order 75. I'm certain 16 of the rising juniors aren't coming back. 17 of the rising sophomores aren't coming back. They're just going to be unofficial dropouts. And I was like, wow, like, and she said it with such a, like, why would you be exasperated or upset about that? That's what's going to happen. And that's when I knew this may not be for me right now. So it was an interesting experience, to say the least. So I'm sorry I didn't say a place where someone stood up, but I do think that some of the younger teachers in the first case scenario wanted to do better, and I think there was some curiosity around why is it okay for me to call a security, which is also, if you know, in New York City schools, they are trained by NYPD. So have someone from NYPD come down and grab Tony, but then have someone else grab another student in a different manner. And I say that the other folks, where we also had interns from Fordham School of Social Work. So what you would see, the school was 99% Black and Latinx, but you would see that the boys, when they want to discipline the boys, they would call, school officer. When they often discipline Latin girls, not Black girls, but Latin girls, they would call social workers. Black girls, they may call 2 officers. And that's a conversation, so even in that, it was a way in which, how do we look at one group as less threatening than the other group? And it was a fascinating experience for me. So rather verbose there. I didn't mean to be that, but it just, it was tough.
Wow. I'm like, I don't even, just pause there and breathe, right? Because it hasn't changed. And that's the sadness of it all, is that when you talked about, Tony, the cultural competency skills that we need to be having in our schools, and how do we support educators, especially educators who are new coming in and wanting to do the good work and what does good work look like ultimately? And again, how are we seeing our young people for who they are versus just the color of their skin? How do we see the potential? And how do, even if they, as young people, it's like, what I want to see in terms of policy and as a, policymaker and stuff, I want to make sure that young people are coming into school and not having to wear the cape of like, I need to make sure my teacher's having a good day, right? Of like, I don't want to piss my teacher off, right? Versus the other way around, right? And making sure that our educators are the ones giving that good energy, that good vibe, and, creating those spaces for young people to feel appreciated, loved, and be seen, and know that if we really rock with a model of you all will be successful, we're going to order those 100 desks, right? And we're not going to limit that because we think kids are not going to come back in certain grades because of whatever their experiences or whatever the case may be. So that really hit me in a very interesting place. And I thank you for sharing that. And then I'll just share, school just started on September 9th. And, I was in the middle of the hall and heard a young man, say something that was super inappropriate to an educator. And I was like, get off his D. Yeah, that's what get off my D and whatever. And I think he was just frustrated in the moment. Maybe the teacher was trying to, I don't know, get him to come back into class. I don't know what the case was. But the teacher really wanted to be like, I want to write him up. That was sexual harassment. And versus, I don't know, let's talk to that young person. Let's figure out what's going on. Where did that come from? Like, if there's a better way to communicate, your frustrations, you're having a bad day, whatever the case is. Because that report right there can instantly go into that young person's file and then become a huge, ball game of something that's not going to be set up for success, right? It's just going to turn them into, the monster, the creature, the somebody that we need to look out for, and like the one who's going to be always on, the safety and security's radar. We don't want that for this young person. And this kid is a freshman. So just coming in, it's not appropriate. And so again, I think it really goes back to how do we support our educators, white, Black, Latinx, like it doesn't matter what your race is, but how do we support our educators to have a skill set of problem solving, being solution focused, thinking about how to meet young people where they are, building relationships, right? Because what we do know is that if you're building strong relationships with young people, they're going to more come to you for support, advice, and just love, ultimately, versus the other way around. And, it's heartbreaking because I'm in a school system and I'm in a school every single day. And so I see it or I see teachers that keep their doors closed and don't really worry about what's happening in the hallways, right? And that's another challenge too, because if our young people are not engaged in going to class and they're just hanging in the hallways, we have to address that as well. So I know we're going to dive deeper, but I think there's work around how do we educate, how do we support our educators to being able to speak up and young students, especially students of color, but how do we also, look at who are our educators that are doing it well? Who are the educators that know and got this and have those strong relationships? And how do we leverage their expertise or their style? And not to say to copy, but just how can we mimic that, right? How do we create a culture that is inviting and warm and comforting versus one that's like, I don't want to go in that classroom because I know already how that educator feels about me. And I think that those are some of the challenges that our young people face and experience on a daily basis. I see it. It breaks my heart. And I don't see it personally, but I hear it from my young people. And that's where I'm just like, we got to do better. And that's what got me into school committee, because I'm like, how do we create professional development where we're learning from each other in a way that we can grow? How do we create these spaces where, if an educator really feels like I had a really bad day with a young person, I'm really struggling on making those connections with them, help. How do I do better? There's a lot of work that we need to do intentionally, but we also know that it needs to also come from the willingness of the educator to say, I want to do this, and know that it's not the student's responsibility, again, to make you have a good day, right? That we have to kind of work in partnership with that.
Tony, any reactions to that before I put my 2 cents in?
No, I think I'm just curious in terms of it's a partnership, but I often worry about this idea that young people have to pull the most weight in that partnership. You know, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but I think in terms of our society, it's like, you know, if an educator may have a bad day, we're like, well, even say an officer, someone would say, well, officers have tough days. They're going to make mistakes, right? Educators have tough days. They're going to make mistakes. But we have to keep in mind our young people's brains are still forming. They have tough days as well. Ayesha talked about her upbringing and kind of what that looks like and kind of the baggage and that our young people are coming in with, and how do you negotiate that. And I've always found it troubling, and I'm not saying Ayesha said this, but as a society, this adultification of children, and I just think it's unfair. So, but I would love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. No, thank you, Tony. It actually is bringing me to more questions, but I think what this brought out for me is, actually, I'm going to first touch on what you just said. What you kept repeating is kind of this, your words are adultification of Black and brown children. And I think as white women, this is super important because we carry the legacy of sort of the threat to us, right? What threat Black people, particularly Black men, and to your point, you know, what is considered Black men comes with this adultification where Black children are included in kind of that threat at much earlier ages. And I think it's very interesting when we look at the history of our country of kind of the threat of Black men to Black women has been such a crux, right? And how in the school system, in the school to prison pipeline, how this is just replicated kind of over and over and over again. And how it's one example of how that myth of threat is still so alive and well and is such a part still of how our policies and practices and decisions happen. Now, so it's kind of to put that, I think then for as white women who are trying to change that, right, both as kind of these actors in it and as white women trying to change it, what I heard a lot of is how we really need to push ourselves to think farther, right? Like when we see those empty desks, why are we not thinking, where are those children? What's happening to them, right? As a fellow social worker, when I hear, you know, social work students are calling, you know, as you said, are calling, you know, for a school resource officer or a police officer for certain children. Those social workers are not thinking, what happens, right?
I want to be fair. Teachers were calling social workers for certain students, and
got it.
So
okay.
It wasn't the social workers, so you guys are still good.
But it happens with social workers too, right? I will say I've seen it with social workers as well, so we can't let ourselves off the. But to the point of kind of particularly white women who are in those roles of teachers, of social workers, when you make those decisions, are you thinking farther into it, right? Are you thinking, what happens when I do this? And to your point, Ayesha, there's kind of this culture of, I'm having a hard time, I'm having a bad day, I just want this to be over with and out of, kind of and thinking about pushing ourselves further and thinking about what are the consequences of when we make decisions like that, and what are we really perpetuating in, you know, and how those little decisions can really be make it or break it for a lot of these young people, particularly the earlier and earlier we talk about this happening. You know, the preschool to prison pipeline is a thing, right? So how are preschool teachers thinking about, when I make these small decisions, what seems like in the early, childhood lifetime, I hold such responsibility in those moments, and how am I taking care of that responsibility? But I also really appreciate, as always, Ayesha, how you're really pushing us to not be pointing fingers, but think about how are we carrying all of us together forward, and that we're all in this together, and how are we helping support each other to walk through this in the right way. So thank you both for that. I wanted to now kind of bring in, this question of what are the consequences of the school to prison pipeline for our children, particularly in this moment, bringing in, that we're missing 3 million children from our school system. There's 3 million children unaccounted for because of COVID-19. And so, want to hear from you all. How should we think about that number? Where, you all, I'm sure, know a lot about, again, hypothetically, but we do on a certain level know what's happening to these children, what they're facing, and what can happen to these children if we don't involve them and get them back. And I think part of that is, it's really interesting. If they're not involved in school, that doesn't mean institutions aren't in their life. And unfortunately, what it means is most likely these other more harmful institutions like the criminal justice system are going to be getting involved in kids' lives. So bringing also into it that it's not that resources aren't being spent on these children. We're just choosing kind of which resources to share with them. So sorry. So that was a lot. So I think just to kind of bring it now to everything that you all have said, now kind of bringing into this COVID moment, and really thinking about the children that are missing, to your point, those empty desks. How are you seeing it maybe in Cambridge as well? What have you been facing? But other school systems, obviously, Tony, you have a lot of experience with other school systems. How are they thinking about these missing children, and what are they doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, in Cambridge specific questions, I'll lean towards Ayesha with the data. It's heartbreaking, the number in which you mentioned. Prior to COVID, any given day, you have about 48,000 young people in some form of juvenile detention center. You also, young people throughout our country who are kicked out of school are 3 times more likely to end up in within the juvenile justice system, if you may, right? Juvenile, some type of system. And of that, 67% of those kids oftentimes will spend some time in prison by 25, right? And so this is a cycle, right? This is a cycle, right? And let's be fair, and let's be clear, when they were looking to break ground on a couple of schools in some dilapidated, kind of build up some dilapidated schools in places like the South Bronx, folks, and these are policymakers, decided, what, we should maybe spend some time looking at other things. And what we would see those dollars be earmarked was to upgrade, Spofford. There's been in some cases more professional development done for educators in schools like, juvenile detention centers, right? Where, let's think about how do we do those things in some of our cities. I've had the opportunity to visit the high school at Rikers Island while in New York City. And it's troubling. It's upsetting. But when you get the opportunity to sometimes talk to these young people, this is their first moment of normalcy and consistency with their education. Their education has been so interrupted, and I want to be fair, this is like 12 years ago, but so interrupted that like they have a level of consistency while they are while they're detained. And in some cases, some of those young people are able to have to be able to go home on the weekends, and they would say, "No, I'll just stay." And it's like this institutionalism where you feel safer inside than outside. And so when we think about these young people who aren't in our seats, we also have a backdrop of a country that's saying, folks are like, well, we don't, the whole mass stuff, folks are going back and forth, or if it's critical race theory. And so all of this conversation that you're having, these young people are being lost in these spaces. And let's also be fair, is that we're looking at center cities where 86% of Black and brown people live, maybe a little less now, but 86%. And Black and brown folks don't make up more than 20% of the population if you kind of aggregate Latinx and Black, but they're disproportionately concentrated in places like Milwaukee and Chicago and Baltimore, right, and all these places. And we know that in a lot of these spaces, we have historically been okay with kids not being in those seats, right? And so it's not like it's something that's totally new. It's more that we have to account for the fact that who's vaccinated, who's not vaccinated, who has, do we have enough PPE, do we have enough computers, right? How many hotspots we have. So now we're able to see that, like, look, when I kind of use my desk example, we're just kind of, so we have governors or superintendents who are saying, I need this many computers. And then other folks are like, wow, but we don't have that many kids. But we didn't have that many kids before. We were just okay with that because we didn't have to account in the way in which we have to account today. So I think we have to have a moral reckoning. And I think, unfortunately, we thought George Floyd was our moral reckoning. And while at the same time, we missed the opportunity to look at how Black women are overly criminalized and are getting, going through a system as predatory as the one in which our Black males go through. And we missed the mark when we look at Breonna Taylor. We even missed it, prior to that, with Sandra Bland. And so the missing faces in these seats is unfortunate, but I think the opportunity is to create apparatus. So I don't want to be too negative here, but I had the opportunity to do some work with, it wasn't really with him, but it was in the New York Public Schools when Cory Booker was mayor. And it was essentially, how do we find our young people and our alternative? They were trying to rebuild through Diploma Plus, which was a provider that was going to help support the development of a new alternative school, if you may. And they had to look at their roles and was like, we don't know where these young people are at. And so they asked me my advice. I said, well, I don't think anything radical. I think we just got to knock on doors. But before that, we have to do some asset mapping. We had to essentially, who's in our community can connect with young people, our churches, the guy at the bodega, right? You know what? The officer that has some connections. What are our assets? What are we doing really well? What aren't we doing well? Who are some of those particular, outliers that we haven't utilized in the last 2 or 3 years? And what we found is that we had a school that probably had, I'm just going to be, transparent here, had about a 25% daily attendance rate, right? We're talking about in October. We were able to get it up to about 76 in February. Now, some may say that's still not, Member Wilson may say, well, we have to have better attendance than that. But look at the gains. And a lot of that was just knocking on doors, going to bus stops, trying to frequent where are these young people at during these days. And I think we also, and that's, some would say, oh, Tony, you're talking about older students. But, we see young people on playgrounds. I know for me, in places, had an opportunity to work on a project in Baltimore as well. And I would just be like, why are people not asking that young person where they're supposed to be? And so we had to kind of change the way in which we thought about young people and how we receive young people and how we love on them. And I think when we do that and are, receptive towards changing, then we can be more intentional around getting them back into those seats. But I just think that we have more data, and that's why we feel like we have to do better. But I think we've always been in this, this space where we've done really bad by our kids.
Yeah. And I think while the data for Cambridge is I don't have the full data. And I will say last year when we had shut down in this pandemic, Rachel Weinstein, who was a member of the school committee, she put out co-sponsored, myself and the mayor, we co-sponsored a motion, a policy order that said we wanted to do student-wide check-ins. We wanted to make sure that young people were being touched, having some level of communication on a weekly basis, just weekly check-ins, not academic check-ins, but just, hey, are you safe? Are you okay? What might be the needs, food insecurity, housing insecurity, the things that many families and households, American families across the world, across the country, but across the world, we're just scrambling and trying to figure things out, figure out food, figure out evictions and different things of that sort because they were losing their jobs, right? And so we wanted to really make sure that we're supporting our families and building those relationships on the same token and just asking, are you okay? And when that motion went through, and it took a while, it took a lot of work. It was a long conversation because what it is many of our schools, we have 18 schools, meaning there are 13 elementary, 4 upper school, middle schools, and our 2 high schools. I hope I did that math correctly. Maybe it's 17. And we just wanted to get that accountability and be able to think about, because families were moving. They were leaving the state to go be with other family members in other states because they felt that it was going to be safer. They don't know what's happening in this, in the start of the pandemic. And so when some schools were doing it one way, whether it was pen to paper and trying to jot down, okay, there was a touch point with little Tony and little Lee and whatever. And some schools had these more, one school, the Cambridge Street Upper School, they did the Cobra Dens, and on a weekly basis, they would bring their community together and have those touch points of like community meeting. And that was happening in a very, great way, but they were able to do attendance through that and know, okay, we're seeing, X number of young people, right? And maybe we're missing 5, maybe it's 2. And so not all the schools were able to adopt that same model, and they were doing things very differently. And when we wanted some kind of universal, district-wide approach to it, it felt like an extra lift. It felt like a burden on building leaders, our teachers, everybody. And that wasn't the spirit of the motion, right? The spirit of the motion was to make sure that we are staying connected with all of our young people and their families and understanding this was a hard time for all of us. So taking that additional 5 minutes or so just to call a family, of course, it's pandemic, so it was hard to be like, do we knock on doors? What does this look like? But hey, we were making sure all of our young people who didn't have Chromebooks got a Chromebook. We were making sure that hotspots were being dropped off to everyone, right? So it was like, why aren't we doing those wellness checks in the same token with that same spirit or with that same energy? And so I don't have the data, but what I can say is that I know Boston has shared some data, and Boston being a much larger district than Cambridge, 20% of students in Boston did not participate in school in the spring. And that is hard to be like, what accounted for that? And I know, speaking to some of my teenagers, the students that I work with, they had to get jobs. They had to become essential employees, right? And so the priority for them was, I'll figure remote learning out, right? I'll make sure my homework gets in, but now I need to figure out how to get food on my family's table, right? How we're going to pay certain bills. And so a lot of students, not that they dropped out, but they just kind of left remote learning to be the other thing that they do, right? And the first thing that they do, the priority that they're going to put out there is trying to get that job, whether it was at the supermarkets, corner store bodegas that were staying open, different things of that sort. And some of them were even volunteering with like the food for free programs and stuff, getting food to other families who were less fortunate. And so we just have to center that and understand that while we think of these numbers and think about the missing, we don't want to go to the negative place of these kids are just in the street, not doing anything, and, perhaps getting caught up in all this other stuff. Not to say some of that wasn't happening, sadly and unfortunately, but our young people also had some other responsibilities to take, to be a part of as well. And, when we think about how disproportionately impacted, like just the conversations that, our educators were able to have and or not having because they felt, there was a lot going on. These are parents themselves. They have to also do lesson plans. They had to switch over to remote learning. When we shut down, it was for a 2-week hiatus, right? A 2-week, we're shutting down. That 2 weeks turned into 18 months, right? And so really, when we think about it, we have to hone in from many different perspectives. And I'm not here to point fingers, but I really, truly know that in that moment of thinking, how can we reimagine, redesign, take charge of the moment, seize the moment. We did not do a good job of that. I will absolutely say that from Cambridge's perspective. I mean, we did a wonderful job in certain areas of the work that we were doing during COVID. That might be making sure our schools had the PPE that they needed, making sure, mitigations and ventilations and all those things were happening. But when it really came down to honing in on our young people, our graduates, our kids of class of 2020, class of 2021, and really supporting those needs, and then identifying what their next steps are going to be for post-secondary, we failed, right? When I think about, there's someone who's watching who lost a child, right? And I'm thinking about her in this moment. I'm thinking about her baby that she lost in this moment to senseless gun violence, who was just taking a gap year, right? Of like, I want to save more money because I don't want to go to college and actually, be doing remote learning or whatever. I want to go to school when it's safe and I can go there and feel good. And he lost his life, right? And he wasn't gang related. He wasn't a, disproportionately impacted kind of kid. He wasn't that child, but unfortunately, that was what he experienced in the life of, I'm sure, many other kids across our country, sadly. When we think about the mental health impacts, right? When we know that our kids are dealing with depression and anxiety and things of that sort, they couldn't get on screen. They didn't, kids left their screen blank, but kids weren't even getting out of bed, right? Kids would just roll over and turn on and just log in and probably go right back to sleep. But because their black box, the screen was there, they were able to be accounted for, so-called accounted for. And so, absolutely, this is the time where we have to hone in into the moment. We have to take a real intentional look at what is our future, what is the setup for us, and how do we move towards success here? How do we hone in on the fact that we failed, right? And we really effed up in many ways. And then how do we take charge for where we move from right now and moving forward? Because I think that's what's critically important at this time. And so I think, I know we're probably going to be closing out soon, but I just want to plug election seasons, right? Like, this is election time. You got to think about your leaders. You got to think about who you're putting into office and the why, right? What is their purpose? What is their mission? How are they trying to dismantle systemic racism throughout all of our districts, all of our systems that we have in place, not just our schools, our housing systems, our economic systems, our, how are we supporting families to really meet their needs? Because what we do know, I can't expect a young person to come to school and show up and be their full selves if they're trying to figure out and navigate what's the safest way to get to school today. What am I actually going to eat this morning? Did I even get a good night's sleep? Because people might be fighting in my homes and all this other things, right? So who are we electing into offices that actually get that and understand that and will speak on that and create policy that helps to change that and dismantle so that we can see a future for better? And that's where I ask for those who are watching Becky Anonymous, to really think about, where is your footing there, right? Like, what is your responsibility as white women, as white people with your privilege, to think about, how can I show up and do good and not perpetuate some of the challenges that our young people are experiencing and going through? And then how do we leverage policy in doing the work as well? Right. And so what are the policies that, the legislation that's going out there right now that can be honed in on by white people, that white people could say, yes, no, we need this one right here. We need all of these issues. We want to make sure that our kids are getting those weekly check-ins and then some. We want to make sure all of our kids are reading by third grade and beyond. We want to make sure that we're, having those rigorous classrooms and making sure that our curriculum is more diverse versus just teaching, that systemic white supremacist history, right? But how do we do more and how do we do better by it? So I'm gonna pause there because I know I've been speaking for a bit, but thank you.
It's awesome, Ayesha. You have flowed just really nicely into, we wanted to bring up some actions and profile some actions. So I'm just going to shout those out a couple that are definitely related to everything you have just brought up, both of you. And then just want to hear last kind of comments and other actions that you might add as well. I think I wrote down, Ayesha, stay in the spirit and seize the moment, and how most of the time I hear those phrases more in this kind of optimistic sort of let's all be joyful and hopeful. And when you heard it, I really felt the equal weight of the accountability and responsibility of that, of staying in the spirit, of seizing the moment. And in kind of that interest, I wanted to highlight a couple of the actions that we've been emphasizing for our viewers. I really loved how much you plugged, like, right now is election season. Like, white women, talk to your representatives, your elected officials, your school committee members, exactly about the things that you just outlined for us about what we can bring up with them, what we can ask them about, what we can emphasize that we want to hold them accountable to. So really appreciate that. I wanted to just plug a couple of things that we've been following here in Massachusetts related to this. So the first one is just, again, making sure that we're not forgetting the eviction moratorium that has expired and how much that's impacting our young people. And Tony, to your point about disrupting education, there's lots of children right now whose education is being disrupted by this. Want to plug that City Life, Vida Urbana, who we've been in contact with a lot around this, is going to be coming out with their study about how evictions have affected Boston communities of color during COVID, and really talking about kind of housing, and obviously there's a huge intersection with education. So tomorrow there's also going to be a webinar about that. So just want to highlight that to our viewers if you're interested in that. Also, the moratorium on jails and prisons in Massachusetts with Build Up People, Not Prisons. So very specifically, we've been profiling a lot the proposal to build a new women's prison. And to your point, Tony, there's kind of this pitch that this is going to be a trauma-informed prison, and really trying to question, is that where resources would be well spent, or if there are many, many other ways that have already been listed today that we could be spending that money to better serve particularly women and girls of color in our communities. And then just wanted to profile on the Congress level, there is the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act. So definitely want to just plug that for just nationally. That is an specific act to kind of talk to your Congress people about and to look into. Of course, to all you Becky's Anonymous viewers, please join us on Wednesday for our Grow Circle, where we'll be diving even deeper into what was discussed in the live stream and really getting into, as white women, kind of what can we take from this conversation, and what actions are being highlighted for us to take. So I want to thank both of you so much for being here. I first want to give you all a chance to say any last thoughts, or again, like actions, or any last words for our audience.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for inviting me here. And as I was listening to Ayesha talk, based on your last question, I just hope that policymakers who are on this call, and who are here with me, would think about, why don't we have youth centers that are open late at night, kind of create new types of schools. How are we, capturing our young people who may not be connected, right? So what does our disconnected population look like? How can we create some level of policy where if a young person may be out of school because of a gun charge, that they don't have to be away from the community? How can we create a community like that? We have young people who have felonies who aren't kind of allowed back in the building, and that's only a matter of time. And so we're implicating them as guilty before they've even had the opportunity to go through the process. So I think that although places like Cambridge are small to a lot of folks, and they're rich with, some would say, resources, I don't think always with ingenuity and creativity, that we have the opportunity to serve as a model of incubation, of doing really cool things. So the fact that even in Cambridge that we're missing young people and we don't know where they are, but we are a city that doesn't have youth centers open on Saturdays and Sundays, it's shame on us. And I think we have to do a better job of capturing the data on, what are our young people doing after school, before school, and kind of reimagining that. When we think about our most vulnerable, why can't we start school at 7 o'clock in the morning for them, and leverage graduate assistance and do some interesting things. So I just think that in all of our cities throughout this country, anyone listening to this call, we have to think about our most creative ideas and figure out a way to put them in action. Because to trust with all due respect, policymakers, to really kind of think creative, they're often going to do things that are politically expedient. And I think we have to just think about how can we push them, but at the same time create spaces for ourselves to move our young people and our families and folks who want to get better. I think as I look at this moment, how do we become a system that looks more at humanity and moves away from, if you read Coates and even Between the World and Me, he often uses so-called white, so-called black. And I think we're in that space where we have the opportunity to shift how we look at the world from a human perspective. So thank you once again for having me.
Tony, you always, even when you're talking, like even when we have phone calls on a regular, Tony is like seriously my brother in good, because I can call him, speak to him, and just have some really in-depth conversations. And half the time, like, I need this recording because I want to go back to it. And, and I'm oftentimes just taking notes and just learning, because you have such a wealth of information and knowledge and experience. So I appreciate you. And I will just say, on that note of like what the school committee and then what city council, what the city holds, it's like a night and day kind of system. And we don't work in partnership as best as we should, or period at all. And that's where it's troubling as well. And so there's a lot of work that I want to continue to do in terms of how we are doing the good work and making sure that we're creating the spaces, the safe spaces for our young people to be after school, during school. And yes, our youth centers is definitely a space where our young people, when we were growing up, all three of us as being kids from Cambridge, we utilize our youth centers in a variety of different ways that I can't say our kids use them in those same ways today. Right. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do. And I think, just having spaces and conversations like this helps. And I think, reaching out, as we discussed already, to policymakers and saying we need to do better in these areas is really what's going to help to push the needle, if that is a thing. But, I think it's more and more that we talk about these things. It's going to be the more and more that folks are going to be listening, and those who really do care about those things will be able to create the power, who will be able to actually move it forward. So Lee, I want to thank you. I want to thank Becky as Anonymous for this space and this platform, and to the audience, right, of just listening, maybe sharing questions, and then feeling free to reach out to us with more. But hold your, leaders and accountable, and really think about asking those questions. Where are our kids? What does the school to prison pipeline actually look like? And where are our youth centers in these moments? Where are our out of school time providers in these moments? And many of them are there and operating during the full pandemic. Even when our schools were shut completely down, many of our nonprofits were out there providing spaces for some of our kids. So thank you again so much, Becky's Anonymous, for the space, and look forward to having more conversations in the future.
Thank you both. We could keep going on for days about this topic, and especially with such wonderful guests like both of you. I again really appreciate your time and energy with this topic and being in this space with us. I'm just going to end with our opening quote to kind of shout out to our audience to take these words with you and take everything that you've learned here today and apply it, as Nelson Mandela encourages us to do, which is to consider how there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And so please, just encouraging everyone to take a moment to think about what is the state of our society soul right now, and how can we all be a part of repairing it. So again, thank you so much, Tony Clark and Ayesha Wilson, and have a good night, everyone out there, and we'll see you next month. Thank you all.